Hi all, I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. And in this video, I'm going to explain all about fluxes, my favorites, what each one is good for and not so good for, so which ones to choose for what kind of work you're going to do. So the question came up about flux and like which one to use and what do you use it for. So I thought we would just go through a little like fast, sort of down and dirty. This is what I use, this is what I use it for, this is what it's good for, what it's not good for. So you have liquid flux, which is usually, there's a couple different brands. This happens to be Batterns. The liquid flux is not particularly concentrated. So I'll use liquid flux when I just have to like solder a little jump ring together. Just a little. Nothing that I'm going to be heating a lot. Not like anything big that's going to take a lot of heat and extended heating. So what flux does, it does two basic things. It absorbs the oxygen so that doesn't combine with the copper in your alloy and oxidize, because if you've ever noticed, if your piece oxidizes a bit, it is definitely, the solder will not flow, or it won't flow very far. So oxidation is not your friend. So oxygen, therefore, not our friend. So that's a big part of what flux does. It absorbs oxygen and keeps that seam clean. And it's considered, like I said, I am not a chemist, but it's considered a wetting agent. It helps your solder to slide. It helps keep things clean. It helps it to travel. Because if you've ever, when I was learning, I loved to just be like, okay, well, they told me I have to do this, but secretly at home, let's try it without and see what happens. And it will not work without flux. just so you know, your solder won't flow. It gets dark, it oxidizes, and it won't travel. Okay? So I do use liquid flux for some things. However, what I use more is I use paste flux. Paste flux is much more concentrated. There's a few different brands. Yes. Like the one I have at home is called Handy Flux. Right. There's this stuff called Dandix. There's also something called Free Flow Flux, which is such a tongue twister. That's also paste flux. Paste flux is very, very concentrated. So if I'm doing anything that I really feel like a big piece, a heavy piece, I'm gonna need to do, that's what this stuff is right in here in this extremely crusty looking jar. Very concentrated. When I have any kind of troublesome soldering or big or anything like that, I go for paste flux, which of course for me means I use paste flux almost all the time because I want like the maximum. You know what I mean? It will absorb more oxygen. It'll work longer, when this is like dead and not helping you anymore, that paste flux is going to still be going.
Okay.
Also another thing, how sometimes you're filling in like a solder seam or something and then you look and you're like, oh, I want to add a little more. Generally speaking, if you're using paste flux, you can just add a little fresh flux and just keep going. It keeps things cleaner. Because if things get too dirty, normally you pause and pickle. But I find with paste flux, I can avoid that more often. If things get really dark and crunchy, you're gonna have to stop and pickle. But I'm just saying, the paste flux, a lot of times I can be like, oh, I need to add a little more and just add a little fresh flux and just go ahead and do it instead of having to stop and pickle. Pickling is a necessity to clean things, but I don't want to get an elaborate setup going, with my third arm and everything's perfectly in position and have to undo it, put it in the pickle and do it in there again, because I don't know if you guys ever notice, it can be almost impossible to get that third arm back exactly where you had it. Can cause a lot of issues. So paste flux, my best friend. One thing, paste flux definitely dries out. And although it will work dry, you'll find that it becomes really impossible to get your solder off your tweezers. So normally at the beginning of every day when I'm gonna go in the studio, I take my flux, I add a little warm water and stir it up so that it's kind of thin and soupy. Because this is so concentrated, you will never notice like a loss of power. Do you know what I mean by watering it down? It's plenty concentrated for anything that we're gonna do. So basically, that's what I do with flux. I'm almost always using the paste flux, but I have the liquid flux here too. And just know though, sometimes if you're soldering a really big piece and you're using the liquid flux, this is the oxygen absorbing capacity of it may be spent before your solder flows. And sometimes that can be, a thing where I'm like, oh, well, let's just switch to paste flux and suddenly everything works great. So keep that in mind. So then, I was saying with the liquid flux, there's a bunch of different brands. You know what I mean? They're all sort of yellowy green and whatever. It's all, I mean, I'm sure they have different formulas, but ultimately, I honestly haven't found there to be like an enormous difference between them. They all seem to more or less do what they're supposed to do. So then we come to something like Fire Scoff. Now, Fire Scoff is basically a relatively new invention. It's got like a ceramic coating. So Fire Scoff it's really great for certain things. It's kind of pricey. It's like about, I don't know, $25 a bottle. And if you're using it a lot, you can go through it pretty quickly. So for me, I mean, you know, you think I buy gold, why am I worried about the cost of my flux? But you would be surprised. Normally what I do with Fire Scoff is I only use it for things that it's really good for. In the sense that if I can just use regular flux, I'm just going to use regular flux. Some of the things that Fire Scoff is really, really good for is it's really good for filigree. Because what you can do after you have all your filigree set up, you can sort of just gently warm your piece and you spray it with a little Fire Scoff and it coats everything. And then you can just sprinkle your solder right on there, and this doesn't puff up all that much.
Oh, yeah,
you don't get as much of that poofiness. You know what I mean? So if I'm doing like a complicated thing with solder and whatever, this is a great way. Warm up the piece, spray it with this, and then you just sprinkle your solder and go to town. It'll stay nice and clean because this acts both to keep the surface clean and it's your flux. You know what I mean? Your solder will flow beautifully. So for things like that, I think this is like amazing, you know? Now, another purpose of this is if you've ever worked in sterling silver, sometimes you can get something called fire scale. And that is something that basically what happens is, you know how you heat up your sterling, it's got copper in there, it gets dark at the surface, right? And that you can just pickle off. However, if you're doing like an extended heating of something, oxygen starts to really penetrate to the deeper levels, and basically you're getting copper oxide inside, you know, deep inside. And it can show up as sort of like purpley, reddish little things, you know, like little spots in the surface. And the problem with it is because it's deep, you can't just sand it off the surface, or you can't just pickle it. So you either have to like really grind down to it or just roll with it, which I don't think is the end of the world personally. However, what I find, we don't have a lot of fire scale happen here in the studio. And I think it's because I teach everybody to solder hot and fast. Get in, get hot, and get the hell out. Slow, extended heating of the whole piece will definitely lead to way more fire scale. So what people will do is they'll do some kind of coating to protect it. Okay, you can use the Fire Scoff to do that.
Yes.
Okay, because that will like seal it up and you won't. But like I said, normally if I'm like soldering a sterling ring, I'm not doing anything special. I'm using my flux, I solder that thing, I get in and I get out, it's over. But like let's say I was soldering a big thick silver cuff and I'm putting some bezels on it or something, and like that thing is going to get a lot of heating. In that case, I am going to want to do some kind of fire coat, something to protect it, which you can use the Fire Scoff. You can also use the homemade fire coat, which I'll talk about in a sec. This is very cheap, easy to make yourself.
It's a flame.
So that's why I use that a lot. So those are some of the reasons you can use Fire Scoff. It's for what it does certain things better than anything else, like the filigree, in other words. But if I'm just trying to protect against fire scale, I'm not going to spend something that's $20 a bottle. I'm going to make this, which is probably like 25 cents to the gallon, and use that. But these are decisions you can make for yourself. But I'm just telling you, this is the way that I kind of think about it. Okay. So then we go on to fire coat. This is something that you make and use to protect from getting the fire scale on the inside. So if you're annealing your sterling or you're soldering your sterling and you're worried about fire scale, you can use this. Also, if you happen to be working in brass or any of the colored gold alloys, you don't want to, if you just heat them up naked, when they oxidize at the surface, you'll have a huge amount of copper to remove. If you've ever done anything in brass, like you heat it up and pickle it, and it's got this thick coating of copper that you have to sand off. Like it doesn't come off in the pickle. And it sucks. looks so much. So if people are working in brass, I always have them coat it in this before they anneal or solder or anything like that.
What is it?
It's nothing but alcohol and boric acid. One of the really cheap sources of boric acid is roach killer. I can bring the bottle from the back. I have a giant thing of roach killer. It was probably like $2.99 for like this giant thing of it. And you can use the same alcohol that you put in like a little sterno thingamajig.
Oh, you can.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, I have seen people use that to clean gold. What they'll do, one of my
Go ahead.
past instructors
Uh-huh.
took that and put it on some gold pieces as a way of cleaning it. Now, I'm not sure what that was doing. There was not a clear explanation of
I'm
it.
slightly confused by that.
I am too.
Because normally, like, if you need to clean, you would use some kind of flux.
Yeah. Or
But this doesn't act as flux, really. This acts like a barrier. I'm sure they knew what they were doing. You know what I'm saying? And it was working and whatever, but
we won't discuss it now. I don't, as I think back, no, she didn't know what she was doing.
Okay.
She didn't know more than I
To
did.
my best understanding
Yeah.
of what this is and how it works, that would not do that.
Okay.
But again, maybe she had some other mixture. She had some other stuff in there. You know, I'm not sure.
Okay, so on the same idea with
Yes.
gold,
Mm-hmm.
what would its purpose then be?
So, for example, if you're working in like 14 karat gold, right? If you've ever soldered something in 14 karat gold, you solder it, you pickle it.
Right.
It's got this gross skin on the surface that doesn't just come off in the pickle, that you have to sand off, that you have to abrade off. So if you're going to be soldering in lower karat gold, you're going to want to coat the whole thing in a fire coat. You can use the fire scoff, you can use the nice cheap stuff right here.
Right.
You would want to protect that surface so you don't get that gross surface, because then the only way to remove it is to sand it off. And you're losing gold and it's time and it's all aggravating. Also, when I'm working with my fancy colored alloys, my 22 apricot, my 22 pink, 18 green, if I'm soldering in them and then pickling, I'm going to end up with an enriched surface with more pure gold at the surface. Now, if you're using 22 yellow, who cares? The more gold, the better. But a colored alloy, you're trying to keep it at that specific blend for that specific color. Like I did a whole apricot gold reposade pendant, and every time I annealed or soldered or whatever, I coated the whole thing in this to keep the color the same, so that I wouldn't have to sand off, because who wants to sand off extra gold? That just seems morally wrong, you know what I mean? Or like if you were working in white gold, any of those alloys like that after heating and pickling, you're going to have a color difference that you would have to sand off. You're going to want to coat it. So that's why a fire scoff is one of those things that, like, you may not use it every day, but for certain things, it's a necessity. And literally, however much of the alcohol you put in, you put half as much boric acid.
That's it.
You keep it in a jar.
That's it.
You know what I mean? That's it. And I mean, it'll evaporate because it's alcohol, which is why you want to keep it like in something with a nice tight lid.
So when you apply it, then you
stir it up.
Your little torch ever so slightly, and it burns it off. It burns the alcohol off and leaves the acid on.
Basically, it leaves that boric acid and makes the coating. So that's what you do. I can show you later if you want. But whatever you do, you take it, you stir it around, and then you light it on fire. And it burns a little green, and it's fun. You don't have to light it on fire. You could also just let it sit for a couple minutes because the alcohol evaporates. But the one thing that I will point out about that is that, remember, you do not want to like coat your piece, put it here, light it up, and you've got your jar open, and you have your nice open jar of super flammable liquid. So like for me, I like dip, put it down, put the lid on, put it up here, a little over to the side. You know what I'm saying? It's all fun and games till somebody throws a firebomb at you. That's like their jar.
Not good.
So, okay, so that is the basic rundown of the stuff I use and why I use it. Is there anything that I didn't cover that you have questions about? God, I'm thorough. Amazing.